The Papadonis clan arrived from Greece in the 1920s, and they settled in a section of Somerville, Massachusetts called Brick Bottom. At that point, the Brick Bottom neighborhood, and it was named so because the streets were paved with bricks. The Brick Bottom neighborhood, which is now an area that is off of McGrath and O'Brien Highway and has been taken away and taken over by the city of Somerville. It's now an artist park. That particular area had many, many Greeks, and it was the first Somerville Greek-Orthodox church was established in that neighborhood. Ironically, my parents, Mary and Nick Papadonis, their families came over from Greece and lived in that neighborhood, and they ended up marrying one another, living across the street from one another in Brook Bottom. My father, after going through World War II in the service, he was an X-ray technician in World War II. Right after that, he came back to Somerville. He married my mother, and my father opened a beauty parlor on Center Street in Jamaica Plain, and held that beauty parlor for his entire lifetime.
Really?
My mother, Mary, was a school teacher and taught for a brief time in Somerville, and then after we were born, my parents moved to Needham, Massachusetts, and that's how we ended up here at St. Demetrios, the original church in Newton Lower Falls. My mother was a school teacher and taught in Needham Public Schools for many, many years. In those early days, it was typical for the suburban Greek families to all go to the cathedral in Boston. And I was probably about 8 years old when my parents came home one day and my father announced that there were a group of families at the cathedral in Boston that had gotten together and had decided that they were interested in possibly building a new church in the suburbs in the Newton area. And at first, I remember vividly, being the oldest of three boys, I was not happy about the situation because my parents would take us to Sunday school at the cathedral every Sunday, and I had established many friends
yes.
at the cathedral, and I was upset about the fact that I thought, some of those were going to fall by the wayside. But in reality, they did not. Many of those friends that I had, they also came to this area. One of the neighbors next to the church owned a radio and television store called Loomis, I think it was Loomis TV, and it was 2 doors away from the original St. Demetrios Church in Newton Lower Falls. And at one point, he had an upstairs section to his store, and he had given it to the church to use for their Sunday school classes. And at that time, my mother was, at one point, the director of the Sunday school. And they held most of the Sunday school classes originally up in that area, as well as in the lower basement of the church. Historically, my parents' generation, Greek picnics were a really big deal. And I can remember the huge picnics that the cathedral would have. And at one point, they had them at a place called Pleasure Island that was in Wakefield, Massachusetts. Thousands and thousands of Greeks would go to this. Another one, the Somerville picnics for the Somerville Dormition Church were held at Camp Ararat in Maynard, Massachusetts. So the new founders of St. Demetrios and Newton Wellesley had this vision that they wanted to hold their own picnic. And being kind of in a suburban or close to an urban setting, they really didn't have an area, so they would hold their first picnics in back of the church, and they would call it Picnic on the Charles, because the Charles River flowed right through the backyard of the church. I also remember another picnic that was memorable, and that is that I think the Loomis family had purchased at one point an old PT boat, and they had a property on, and I was so young I can't remember, but they had a piece of property on an island off of Cape Cod, and it may well have been one of the Elizabethan islands that was off of Falmouth and Woods Hole. And one year they actually trucked the entire church population from Falmouth to this island on a PT boat, and multiple trips from Falmouth over to the island, and held a massive Greek picnic on this island where and they had a lobster feast where they cooked lobsters outside on seaweed. So yes, there were picnics held. Where the Marriott sits today up the street was called Norumbega Park.
Norumbega, still
and,
is, yes.
And at that time, a gentleman who was also an early founder of the church, Mr. Canavas, and his family owned the Norumbega Park property. And the reason that it was so popular with the church was that originally, not only did Norumbega Park have the pond there where you could use pedal boats and canoes, but it was also an amusement park. So the church had the amusement park for their picnics use for an entire Sunday.
Yeah, Peter Canavas.
Peter Canavas was exactly correct.
You know if any of these people are still living today?
I do not. There was a Canavas who was also my generation. I was born in 1950, and he was born the same year, and I don't know if I've lost track of him. So yes, there were picnics held. Where the Marriott sits today up the street was called Norumbega Park.
Norumbega, still is, yes.
And at that time, a gentleman who was also an early founder of the church, Mr. Canavas, and his family owned the Norumbega Park property. And the reason that it was so popular with the church was that originally, not only did Norumbega Park have the pond there where you could use pedal boats and canoes, but it was also an amusement park. So the church had the amusement park for their picnics use for an entire Sunday.
Yeah, Peter Canavas.
Peter Canavas was exactly correct.
You know if any of these people are still living today?
I do not. There was a Canavas who was also my generation. I was born in 1950, and he was born the same year, and I don't know if I've lost track of him.
And then the priest that you remember the most was
Father Bulgaris.
Yes.
He was very, very young, in the very early years of the church, and had a terrific following. Another memorable priest who historically left a tremendous imprint here on the church was Father Gallus, who also had a son from my generation who was who was an altar boy and member of the Goya, St. Demetrios Goya, John Gallus. The Bassett boys, Kritzis,
Jimmy, yes.
Yep, Kalyanidis, Stephanie Mavridis.
Now, Kalyanidis now tell me about that family.
That's a large family. They actually, up until a couple of years ago, the family owned New England Tea and Coffee in Malden. And they came to St. Demetrios probably, I would say, around 1962 or 63. And there were two boys, Jimmy and Michael, and their daughter Cindy, who is married to Father Dean Paleologos, who recently retired from Worcester. And actually, the interesting point about the Kalyanidis family is that it's the only time when a father, Basil Kalyanidis, and his son followed, becoming past presidents of St. Demetrios. So Basil and both Jimmy Kalyanidis were both presidents.